Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. Culture-based ethnic businesses. Many of the early immigrant groups established cultural niches, niches, cultural niche.
So you can see the word niche is clearly marked as niche. The plural is niches, and the past tense of the verb is niched. However, this is a fairly old book, so let's look at a source that is a little bit more modern. We'll go to dictionary.com. Now, when we go to dictionary.com, they list the first pronunciation as niche and the acceptable alternative pronunciation as niche, meaning that either one is correct. Now, a lot of people think that the correct way to pronounce this word is naturally niche because it comes from the French word niche, and the letter I in French would be pronounced like a long E, as we would say it. Now let's consult the Merriam-Webster dictionary because they actually have a nice, concise explanation of is it niche or niche on their website. So I'm going to read a little bit to you. How do you pronounce niche? Is it niche or niche? There is a debate about how you are supposed to pronounce niche. There are two common pronunciation variants, both of which are currently considered correct. Niche rhymes with the word sheesh, and niche, which rhymes with the word pitch. Niche is a more common one, and the older of the two pronunciations. It's only pronunciation given for the word in all the English dictionaries before the 20th century. So I won't read this whole thing to you, but the more modern pronunciation has become niche, because you see a lot of people online saying niche, and so many people now say it in YouTube videos or wherever you see them online, that it actually sounds wrong when you hear someone say niche, but it's not wrong, it's just a little more traditional. So however you like to say it is fine.
Niche it is. Cultural niches, or turf control over certain public sector jobs, businesses, and vocations. When these groups cornered niches, they then had avenues for providing employment, business, and political opportunities to incoming members of their group. Control of these social and economic areas promoted intra-group dependency. They provided opportunities to attract capital, market their culture, maintain a community economy, and exact ethnic economic accountability. Black communities do not own or control socio-economic centers within their communities. Douglas Glasgow, a sociologist, pointed out many of the traditional examples of ethnic economic centers in his book, The Black Underclass. He wrote, the Italians sought and ruled the shipyards, docks, unions, ethnic restaurants, and fire departments. Jews took over the garment and jewelry industries, banking and lending industries, major professions, and entertainment. The Irish dominated the alcoholic manufacturing, distilling, and distribution industries, police departments, and bars. Asians established ethnic oriented communities, restaurants, cleaners, stores, and supply houses. Blacks were not permitted to establish culture based businesses. Prior to emancipation, the North and South enacted laws and ordinances that prohibited blacks from owning businesses that competed with whites. Even after emancipation, that remained the case. Blacks were prohibited by the legal and social sanctions that withheld capital, market opportunities, access to resources, and education from establishing businesses. Even in raising tobacco, cotton, and various livestock, where blacks had unquestionable skills, they were generally forbidden to raise and sell their products in competition with whites. A horse racing industry is another example. After the Civil War and until the first decade of the 20th century, black jockeys dominated the horse racing industry. Although they were skilled jockeys and horse trainers, blacks were not allowed to develop any businesses based upon their experience around the tracks. By the by the second decade of the 20th century, horse racing had become a major sport and wealth building business. Black jockeys and trainers were replaced by white trainers and Hispanic jockeys. Blacks were not allowed to compete with whites at any level of life. No other racial or ethnic immigrants have been confronted with such systematic opposition to their personal freedom, economic independence, and right to earn a living. Blacks lack a sense of unity. Another reason that blacks cannot emulate ethnics is their lack of group unity or sense of community. Racial integration, black people's long-standing objective, racial integration, black people's long-standing objective, is the antithesis of group togetherness. Integration fragments blacks into even smaller groups and scatters them among the majority white society. This scattering has destroyed the cohesion of black communities. Upper and middle class blacks live in small enclaves as powerless minorities among white majorities all across the nation. They are isolated, without a bond to their racial roots, and typically see themselves as disunited, weakened people. Although it raises a great deal of emotional conflict, successfully integrated blacks invariably find comfort and security in being white in most respects except color. There are few emotional bridges back into the black community. There are few emotional bridges back into the black communities, so they identify with and support the power and material resources of the white communities. Government and dominant white society have historically rewarded blacks who identified with the larger white community and placed their welfare above that of the black community. For selling out their own community, blacks were often rewarded with special positions, money, and meritorious manumission. There has been no similar legal or reward system to encourage members of Asian or Hispanic groups to turn against members of their own race. Contrarily, they have received rewards for maintaining a strong sense of community and ethnic identity. Cultural unity and community cohesiveness have been the key to their survival. They came with extended families intact. They came with the freedom to send back for loved ones they had left behind. They engaged in trade, moving goods and currency back and forth. They were generally free to practice their cultures in this country. guard their traditions, school their children in their own languages, practice their respective religions, and in every other way live as free citizens. None of those freedoms was historically available to blacks, certainly not during slavery. Ethnic immigrants have good reasons to have a completely different frame of reference about America than do blacks. Ethnics enjoy the support, economic, social, and otherwise, of the dominant white society. The government has been a great deliverer of jobs, wealth, and relocation assistance to ethnic immigrants, to which the recent North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, with Mexico will attest. Contrary to the moral of the Alger, Horatio Alger story, that every individual and group should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, immigrants have historically received governmental assistance. In the Southwest, illegal immigrants from Mexico who never paid taxes have no difficulty securing welfare, social security benefits, education, or medical care. More than 50% of the babies born in some hospitals in Southern California in 1993 were born to illegal Mexican aliens. Free access to public services and benefits without having to pay centuries of dues shapes the way immigrants see America. Ethnics do not view discrimination in the same way black people do. An immigrant may be more willing than blacks to sweep the streets and polish doorknobs because he would have little reason not to believe that his future will be better, if not for himself, then for his children. Blacks have no such optimism. They have spent centuries sweeping, walking, and living on the streets, and they realize that a brighter future for themselves and their children is questionable. Skin color. Skin color is the single most important factor that prevents blacks from emulating ethnic immigrants because it defines their role, status, and limits their access to resources. The skin color and physical attributes of non black ethnic immigrants is much closer to that of whites. White ethnics and Asians are more acceptable to the dominant white society than are blacks. The long history of American race relations seems to point to one fact that blacks' high visibility has made them a convenient target for many of the social conflicts and insecurities of each white ethnic group that has reached these shores. Ethnic ethnic immigrants learn early, and one of the last things they forget is to avoid contact with America's black pariah. Other groups can blend in and or assimilate into the dominant culture. Blacks' skin color does not permit them to blend. Blackness phobia. For centuries, the concept of blackness has held intense meaning for whites. The black color has the ability to distort, dominate, or totally obliterate whiteness or absence of color. The concept threatens whites' ingrained values of culture, race dominance, bloodlines, and genetic purity. White society's fear of blackness, power and potency necessitated legal definitions that track the flow of black blood. The fear of blackness made it important that society rigidly defined who and what was black. Once defined, neither black persons nor their blood were permitted to assimilate into mainstream society or white veins. Even a small quantity, one drop of black blood, could dominate white blood and determine a person's race. Across the nation, laws were enacted defining who was black. These laws established strict standards for whiteness, declaring that 1/4, 1/16, or even one drop of black blood made a person black, while conversely, no amount of white blood in the human body could dominate a single drop of black blood. No other ethnic population in the nation, including those with visibly non white biological features, have ever been so rigidly defined. The one drop rule was once used as a standard by the U.S. Census. James F. Davis, in his book, Who is Black? One Nation's Definition, lamented how blacks are held to a different blood lineage definition than members of any other racial or ethnic group. For example, Indians, who are typically held to be worse off than blacks, were never held to the same degrading standards as blacks. Persons of 1/4 or less American Indian ancestry were not generally defined as Indians unless it was their choice. Either way, they were acceptable to the larger society and could assimilate. The same seems to have applied to immigrants from the Far East and the Pacific Islands. There are no statutory efforts in America to determine which persons were 1/8 Hungarian, Russian, Japanese, Mexican, Turkish, Canadian, or members of any other immigrant groups. The quantity of blood, or the one drop rule, or the one drop of blood rule targeted blacks. The quantity of blood, the quantity of blood, or the one drop of blood rule targeted blacks. As James F. Davis said, Americans do not insist that an American with a small fraction of Polish ancestry be classified as a Pole, or that someone with a single remote Greek ancestor be designated as Greek, or that someone with any trace of Jewish lineage is Jewish, or nothing else, and nothing else. The blood rule was practiced to keep the offspring of mixed marriages from passing. Passing is the practice of a light skinned black person living as a white or person of another race. Again, when non blacks decide to assimilate into the larger culture, they are rarely restricted, ostracized, or confronted with charges of passing. Mixed ethnics, especially second generations, are free to be whatever ethnic or racial group they declare themselves to be. The groups. Okay. Harold Harold Cruz says blacks have never had the option of being anything more than what dominant white society would let them be or wanted them to be. The groups to which blacks are equated under the broad minority category all have options. They can change their names, language, culture, country of residence, nationality, sexual preference, and religious affiliation. Since the basis of discriminating against blacks is skin color, blacks will have options only when they learn how to change their color. But on the other hand, that would create the problems of passing, the psychological and economic baggage of passing. Dark skinned blacks reacted to light or mixed blacks passing with feelings or blacks or mixed blacks passing with feelings of abandonment and anger. Many felt offended that a mixed black would reject or choose to live as someone other than a black person. Whites took offense because the passing black had beaten their blood blood monitoring practices and was unlawfully enjoying the fruits of white society. On the other hand, passed dark-skinned blacks passed during slavery in reverse. Darker darker black slaves who ran away passed by pretending they were freeborn or freed blacks. The darker skinned blacks dressed and acted as if they had natural rights to freedom. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Okay. Immigration laws. Immigration laws create and maintain a racial, ethnic, religious, and color balance in America. Color gradation has been an important ranking factor. The darker the skin color, the lower the immigration quota. Blacks have the darkest skin color with a racial quota of zero. A writer for the Virginia Gazette, as far back as the 1700s, alluded to the foolishness of such an order of acceptability. If Negroes are to be slaves on account of his color, the next step will be to enslave every mulatto in the kingdom, then all then all Portuguese next all Portuguese next to French, then the brown complexioned Englishmen, and so on until there be only one free man left, which will be the man of the palest complexion in the three kingdoms. During the century during the century that followed, quotas kept free blacks out of the country, with the exception of the English. The codes restricted new immigrants from any one country to 2% of the number of the individual's nationality residing in the continental United States as determined by the census of 1890. Immigration laws passed in the 1880s and 1890s were based on the census figures of 1790. Of 1790, blacks were slaves and not considered citizens. Thus, with the exception of a few blacks from the Caribbean islands, blacks were excluded. Almost 30 years later, in 1924, the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service upheld the zero immigration quota for blacks, and they were officially shut out of the United States until 1960s. The quota remained zero until 1965, when black African nations began to receive their independence from colonial rule and had to be officially recognized. Mhm. One can only suppose that as these nations ascend in power and wealth, the American immigration quotas for their citizens will rise accordingly. Black patriotism. Ironically, no other racial or ethnic group in America has demonstrated the long term patriotism of blacks. Blacks are the only non white people to have fought in defense of America in every military conflict since the country's beginning. Blacks have fought in armed conflicts against the mother countries of most of the ethnic immigrants now in America. For nearly 4 decades, blacks were the first to die in support of the principles of the nation. Yet they are excluded while foreign immigrants arrive daily to the doors of this great nation, and are welcome. The ethics of hard work. It is common to hear Japanese, Chinese, and Germans being cited as model hard workers. Before blacks became obsolete as common labor in the 1960s, they were the models for doing the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous, and backbreaking work. Ironically, conservatives and government are suggesting that emulating these recent immigrants and their hard work is the cure for blacks' protracted poverty and high unemployment. Recommending more hard work for a race of ex slaves is similar to curing an alcoholic by suggesting that the drunk do more drinking. Having never been compensated for centuries of past labor is the bigger part of that problem, not whether black people are willing to work hard. If blacks were unwilling to work hard, it would be understandable after 400 years of no pay and low pay. If blacks were unwilling to work hard, it would be understandable after 400 years of no pay and a low wage and low pay of no pay and low pay. If blacks were unwilling to work hard, it would be understandable after 400 years of no pay and low wage. With ethnic immigrants in America, which ethnic which which ethnic immigrants in America have worked harder than the black slaves? Certainly, the Japanese, Chinese, and Germans did not work harder in America than black slaves. If the Japanese, Chinese, and Germans were the hardest workers, would it not have made more sense for colonial white society to have enslaved the Japanese, Chinese, and Germans rather than blacks who were allegedly lazy and unwilling to work? Why would supposedly bright businessmen spend 250 years traveling halfway around the world to kidnap 35 to 50 million innocent but lazy blacks, then knowingly bring them to America to do work that other ethnic groups could do better? Even in instances where these ethnic groups worked hard, they did it with the consciousness of paid free men. The indentured servants from India, the Chinese coolies, though they were mistreated, were still free and paid for their labor. They had the option to quit and return to their homelands anytime they so desired. The sweatshops in New York City were reprehensible, but the Chinese workers were free and paid. They were not property. No one owned, beat, or killed them, and their families were not working. The Japanese are often held up as labor models for blacks, but blacks were never treated as well as the Japanese. Even though blacks fought with the American military troops against the Japanese in World War II, if blacks had been treated as well as the Japanese, perhaps then they too could be held up as great respecters of hard work. The United States government paid $20,000 in reparations to each Japanese American who was forced to live in internment camps during the 4 years of World War II. For their 3 to 4 years of internment, the Japanese Americans were compensated nearly 42 years later. Not only did the United States government award reparations to each relocated Japanese, it gave the Japanese community a national apology. Granted, the reparations made after years of court battles, and after most of those entitled to them were already dead, can in no way compensate for what was lost. Still, it was a debt acknowledged and paid. Blacks, on the other hand, after 400 centuries of lost humanity, life, and wealth, have received nothing. The myth of hard work. The myth of hard work. The moral value of work was promoted under the aegis of Puritan ethics that most early colonial settlers preached about, but did not practice. The intense labor demands of the New World required most settlers to work, but contrary to the moral myth, they tried to avoid work by forcing others to do it for them, while they took credit and the profits. White society was especially adept at avoiding certain kinds of work when blacks were present. Since hard work in and of itself did not convey nor confer dignity, they did not want blacks to see them doing lowly work. Arduous work, arduous work carried a low status and was routinely avoided by whites who preferred being seen in a management capacity. The white Southerners' disdain for hard work was commonly accepted in and around immigration ports. Stanley Liebergott, in his book The Americans and Economic Record, supported the common impression that if anyone was lazy, it was more likely the enslaver rather than the enslaved. Modern day conservatives Modern day conservatives continue to believe that the answer to black America's problem is more diligence and hard work. In his book, The Economics and Politics of Race, conservative black economist Thomas Sowell is eloquent in his admiration of immigrants' willingness to work long and hard to get ahead. However, he condemns blacks on the assumption that blacks develop poor work habits and the resistance to work that had developed under slavery. Thomas Sowell believes the lazy slave myth, though the term lazy slave is an oxymoron. Yeah. The term lazy slave is an oxymoron. A lazy slave would have had a very difficult time surviving the under the inhumane conditions of the American slavery. Sowell apparently feels that black people had an obligation to produce for their overseers. Why why blacks should have felt such an obligation is unclear. Stripping people of the fruits of their labor takes away the primary motive for them to work. Stripping people of the fruits of their labor takes away the primary motive for them to work. Absent personal compensation, what were the incentives for slaves to work harder? Would they have been emancipated or received compensations or reparations for doing so? Would the slaves have gotten better food, shelter, clothing, education, or pensions in an early retirement? Would the race's stolen humanity, wealth, and cultural heritage have been returned? Or did the slaves know the answers to these questions and realize that the cold, hard truth was that most slaveholders preferred to work slaves to death in their prime to avoid the expense of taking care of them in their old age? Who was lazy? The white slave masters bragged about building a wealthy aristocracy that could devote its time to a leisure life in the study of art, philosophy, and the finer things in life. The Earl of Egmont in 1740 quoted a Carolina merchant who sought to avoid work. He said, Where there are Negroes, a white man despises to work, saying, What? Will you have me a slave to work like a Negro? Have, okay. Where there are Negroes, a white man despises to work, saying, Where there are we, where there are Negroes, a white man despises to work, saying, What? Will you have me as a slave and work like a Negro? Winthrop, Winthrop D. Jordan, author of White Over Black, supported the white slaveholders' need for black laborers, stating that it was impossible for white men to do work in the fields because the labor was so severe that hundreds of Negroes nearly lost their lives through hard work. Even the paid white servants did not perform the extremely hard work when blacks were available. The white masters prided themselves on being a leisure class and only doing gentlemen's work. If the 5 million black slaves were lazy, they took their example from the best teachers. If the 5 million black slaves were lazy, they took their example from the best teachers. What immigrants came to America for the purpose of hard work? What immigrants came to America for the purpose of hard work? In the formative years of this nation, most immigrants coming to America were vagrants, criminals, hustlers, adventurers, and others seeking to strike it rich or strike it rich quick. America was advertised as a place of unlimited land, natural resources, and slave underclass. The hard work myth for immigrants contradicted the inscription of the uh, Statue of Liberty, which says, "Give me your tired, yearning to be free. You're tired, you're poor." Tired immigrants did not leave their native lands around the world to come to America so they could work even harder. They could have worked hard wherever they were. They came to America to be free of undue hard labor. They came seeking opportunities to accumulate the fruits of their relatively easy labor here. They came to enjoy labor saving devices, and they came escaping from the underclass status in their own countries to a place where to a place with a ready-made underclass, black people. At last, they knew they would not be on the bottom rung. Mhm. Who's in racial and ethnic rankings? If blacks are at the bottom, who is all right, y'all. Y'all, some folks. Pain, pain in the buttocks.